Hello everybody, this is BKC back in from the depths on my engine testing platform. And today what I want to talk about is a few tricks, tips, and stuff I've learned recently. And the first one I want to say is I found on this motor right here. And what this motor is I built this motor playing around with my 3T design, and I was trying to beat it. And what I realized, and it kind of goes back to another trick that I'll show, is cutting cores down and keeping their efficiency. And we've seen that in the beam motors a little bit. In the beam motors over here, we were able to build a baseline beam motor, which is this one right here, and then we was able to make it more efficient and give up a little bit of space, and then we was able to cut it down and keep the exact same efficiency numbers and do it in less space. And then we was able to take all the benefits of all three motors and pack it into one motor, keep the smaller space of these two motors, keep the same core layout of this motor, and then keep the efficiency of this motor all in one motor. And I've been playing with that. In the motor right here, you will see, if you go on the forum, you look around the forum, you look at almost any forum, you'll probably see this motor. It's a pretty common motor. And I think it was, I don't remember the user who made it, but it was dubbed the evil brick, because it's just a tiny little 1200 horsepower motor that fits in the same space as my 3T design, but it makes 3 times the horsepower and is pretty much the same fuel efficiency. So it's probably about the pinnacle of a 3x5x5 design. And where did it come from? How did somebody make this motor that? And the first trick really is cutting motors down. And once I built it and looked at it and stuff, and what I realized, it's really just a hypercube. If we look at the hypercube, we can see that it's on the top. It's a radial with the carburetor sharing between each cylinder, making 800 horsepower. And then under each carb, we have another cylinder with the alternate core layout pattern to get more power out of those carbs, and still provide the benefit of efficient exhaust collection. And if you take the hypercube and just cut the bottom cylinders off, you still wouldn't have a 3x3x5 cube. You would have a 4x5x5 cube. So what you have to do is you have to just rotate the crank. Instead of making the crank go vertical, you make the crank go horizontal, which, instead of using adapters to get these cylinders on, you got a crank taking up that space. And instead of having to crank vertically through here, you would have it horizontally. And instead of having the crank come up and collect these for radials, you just have an adapter up here. And what that does is that puts the engine block in the back, where it's less wasteful. But having it down here would be wasteful and break the binding box. So, but this provides one disadvantage to the hypercube's layout. It cuts the power in half, and I think it keeps the same efficiency, 1288. I don't think the hypercubes, yeah, 1288. They're same efficiency. So it kept the same efficiency. It cut it in half, and it put it in a smaller binding box. Now, density-wise, it cut the density down in half, actually more than half, because 5x5x5, a 2x5x5 space, we're not cutting it exactly in half. This is 125 cubes of space. this is 75 cubes of space. So we're not cutting it in actual half, but we're cutting the power in half. So the density goes down a little bit, but we're able to keep the efficiency numbers of the hypercube, and it makes a good all-around little motor. But rotating the crank in the hypercube, where we could collect most of the exhaust, there is a spot on the hypercube, and I'll show that next. Same thing, where the engine block prevents us from collecting exhaust. And this motor, if we run it, we notice that it gets exactly 30 exhaust gases. So that's what's beautiful about this little evil brick, is that it's probably the smallest, densest, core layout, and that you can make a motor and still get 30 exhaust. But the problem with it, and it's basically because I'm a little bit obsessive compulsive, is I want all my exhaust being collected parallel, and then I want to feed them through the turbos serially, and I don't want to compromise on that. But on this motor, there's one exhaust right here that can't be collected because of rotating the crank. And if we look at the efficiency numbers at 100%, it's 1288. At 50%, it's 631 versus 653. And at 10%, it's 244 versus 247. Now, why is there a difference in numbers? Well, the difference in numbers is because of this motor not collecting this one exhaust. It's kind of trapped. So, like I said, and this kind of is from me being more obsessive compulsive. I don't want to use that exhaust if I can't put it into the system collected parallel and put it into system. But here, what we are doing is we're using that exhaust, and that's one thing you should always do. Use the exhaust no matter what, whether it's series, parallel, or not. You should set up your motor, collect as many exhausts as you can that are not blocked by other parts parallel, and then send them through your turbos serially. And then any motors that are blocked or locked off, make the decision, can you snake it around some kind of way, move some parts, change the core, do something with it. On this particular motor, there's nothing we could do except stick it in the turbo chain non-serial. So what we're creating is a series parallel, slash parallel exhaust system. And what does that do to the motor? Well, if we run it, it doesn't do anything at full power, 1288.9. It didn't change anything. What it does is we have our 30 exhaust going into this turbo. See it right there. 30 exhaust going into this turbo, 30 exhaust going into this turbo, 30 exhaust going into this turbo. But now the other half of the motor is now getting 32 exhaust. So half of the motor is receiving 30 exhaust, the other half is receiving 32 exhaust. Since we're over 30 at all times at full power, it's going to make no change. It doesn't do anything. But if we come down to 50%, where these exhausts are getting 15 exhaust gas, these turbos are getting 16. So that should affect the efficiency a little bit, because this one has a 2.51 efficiency, this one has a 2.6 efficiency. So that's what happens in the mid-range. We get a little bit better mid-range. Now it's 653 before. I forgot what it was before, but it gave us a little bit more and knocked off a tiny bit in the mid-range. I think it dropped 0.1 in the mid-range or something like that. So it saved us a little bit. It made us a little bit more efficient. And then at the 75%, 80% mark, it actually reaches efficiency a little bit higher up, I think. Yeah, 1288. No, at 100%. It's still at 100%, but I guess because these exhausts reach maximum efficiency maybe at like 98%, but since these are losing efficiency, these are making up for it. So it still caps out at 100% efficiency. But it did help in the mid-range a little bit. So I started going through all my motors again, and the Evil Brick had the same problem, is that down here where we're feeding the exhaust in, there was 4 exhausts right here that couldn't be collected. Well, 3 really, because these 3 were trapped. This one is where I was feeding the parallel side into the serial side, and this one could be collected. But like I said, because I'm a little bit obsessive compulsive, I didn't like it being imbalanced like that, and I didn't do it. But since it came back and did it on the Evil, the Hypercube, and it knocked off a little bit. Same thing. It made the mid-range, I think, like a couple hundred points more efficient in the mid-range, and dropped like 0.1 or 0.2 fuel off, and then it even dropped like, I think, 0.1 off in the upper end. I mean on the bottom end. So it made it better on the Hypercube too. And I started going through and looking at motors and seeing where I could do this. And there wasn't too many, because I almost, like I said, obsessive compulsive, and I try to make everything where everything is parallel collected and serial through the turbos, and I usually try to optimize motors, the core layout, to where they don't do that. And there wasn't that many. The point is there wasn't that many, and because of that, there's not much that I can improve on. But there's also plenty of designs that I cannot do, because I am striving to make perfect efficiency like that. Now the second trick I'll show you is in my designed motor, my 16 density 2400 horsepower motor, which is pretty much the same core layout. I derived the same core layout as that, but I did it in a different route. Now this design had superchargers on all the turbos, and what I started realizing is that superchargers don't really, if you was going to use this motor as a kinetic drive and spend a lot of time in the low RPM, you probably wouldn't want to make this modification. But if you was using it as a backup generator and was spending more time at the high end and in the mid-range, you probably would want to do this trick. And what it involved is getting rid of the superchargers, and down here, if we go into, or I'll do it on the top because you can see it easier. On the top, I didn't have this exhaust collection ring because I didn't need it. I could collect my exhaust here and go, straight through, and go down here to where my parallel exhaust collection manifold. I just had a regular old cross collection manifold, and I went down right here into my parallel collection manifold to where it went into my serial side right here. But at the top, if you look right here, collecting this exhaust going here could be done with a turbo instead of a corner pipe. And here I could do it too, instead of a corner pipe. But to do that, I had to put a collection ring going around the turbos, which wasn't no big deal because it's symmetrical with the bottom. And basically I was about to get 4 turbos in the place of 4 superchargers, and then I did that here on the bottom, which I didn't have to make any modifications. I just was using a elbow pipe right here, and instead of an elbow I used a turbo. Now what did that do to the motor? Of course, losing a supercharger on each motor got rid of 43% efficiency on the bottom end. So the bottom end suffered, and I think the bottom end was almost like at 400 and something at 0.6 fuel. So I gained a little bit of fuel consumption on the low end, but on the top end, where the turbos would only get me 5% efficiency, I mean the superchargers would only give me 5% efficiency back into my carburetors. Since this only has 8 carburetors and I was able to get 8 turbos in there, now I'm getting 31% on the top end, and I think it's like 18% on the mid-range. Let's see. I think the superchargers were giving me 22% at 50% load, and the turbos are giving me 18% equivalent. So a little bit less, a few, 4% less on the mid-range, but once we get above like about 52%, the turbos start overtaking the superchargers. So the mid-range is actually down a little bit. I think it went from 13 something down to 12.99, but the fuel consumption stayed the same. So that 4% didn't really make up for it. But the top end went from, I think, 15 something to 16.92, and actually dropped 0.2 fuel, which actually makes up for the extra 1 fuel at the low end, and the lack of power per fuel in the mid-range. The higher number of the power per fuel and the actual loss of fuel consumption made up for it. So this one's not a definitive do it or don't do it. If you could fit a turbo in the place of a supercharger, it's very, very specific. There's not a lot of motors you could do it with, because you have to have 2 conditions. You have to have the space above the carburetor open, and you have to need to have the ability to take a exhaust into your parallel side using a turbo. And then at the mid-range, it just depends on whether you have a kinetic drive versus a generator side, whether you spend more time at the low end versus more time in the bottom end or the top end. So it's very, very limited use case, but it is a trick you can use to get more top end efficiency at the expense of some bottom end efficiency with superchargers. And it might be a case why you don't see a massive amount of superchargers in really, really efficient designs. I was able to do it here on this motor. No, I think it's this motor you could see it the most, where this exhaust was being collected here and going into my serial side with the elbow, and I had a supercharger here. I was able to put a turbo into place and do the same job. I was able to do it here. I was able to do it up here at the top here, and then on the front of the motor I was able to do it here, here, and here. So I was able to get there's only 3 carburetors I wasn't able to get an extra turbo on, but this motor did the same thing. The bottom end got a little bit worse because we traded turbos for superchargers. And can I do it here where the superchargers are? No, I don't think. no, because there's no place for the exhaust to go where the superchargers are hidden down inside that motor. But the efficiency of the bottom end got a little bit worse. The mid-range stayed relatively the same. The power per fuel numbers went up a tiny bit, but the fuel efficiency stayed the same. And then the top end, I think on this motor, since we're hitting maximum efficiency, it doesn't really affect the top end efficiency, but it did lower the fuel consumption a little bit. So that, like I said, is not that much clear cut or can be used very often. But the other trick of not using every exhaust, whether it is series or parallel, is something that you should always strive to use. And it shows up here in this motor. And this motor I made by looking at a picture on the forum by a user named Killshot. He designed this motor, and it's 6,400 horsepower, 44 cylinders with a 50 density, which might sound familiar. And it's because this motor is 44 cylinders, 6,400 horsepower, but with a 21 density. So Killshot's motor uses more space, but achieves more efficiency. And matter of fact, it's like 4.2%, 4.2 times better fuel efficiency or less fuel usage for giving up more space. And the way he achieved that is, if you look at his core is actually, I think if you do just the core calculations, this is like a 59 density just for this core. If you do the core density on Killshot's motor, this core layout is only a 3 by, if you exclude the crank, this core layout is actually 86 density on his core layout. And you go, well, why would having a denser core be better? Because he's just got to use more space to actually build the motor. Well, by having a denser core, we need the denser core because we need to waste more space with more cranks and more turbos to achieve more efficiency. So if you include the cranks, the density goes down, but the space that is wasted in this motor is used for collecting exhaust, and kind of locks out the use of more turbos to make it more efficient. In Killshot's motor, the space being wasted by having more cranks, it opens up the space to put more turbos, and then makes it a conjoined twin motor where we have two sets of cranks, and it spaces the carburetors out evenly, which in my last video I talked about how evenly spacing the carbs can achieve a better efficiency, and it allows the space wasted by the crank to be better utilized for more turbos, and it allows for good exhaust collection because right here, it's kind of hard to see, this motor has a cylinder going down, and there's an adapter in there making a radial pattern, and two radial patterns come together where one exhaust gets, like right here, one exhaust collects four exhaust, and then it spits out where it collects another 4 exhausts with just like 3 exhaust pipes. 3 exhaust pipes collects like 8, and then every exhaust pipe you add in collects even more exhaust. So this core layout, if you just go just the core parts, is denser than that motor's core layout, but when you include all the wasted space of the double cranks and spacing the carbs evenly all the way around, it becomes a less dense. And this motor technically wouldn't be possible with my obsessive compulsiveness of being 100% series and 100% parallel. So essentially what this motor is doing all three tricks. What it's doing is it's taking this core layout and cutting it in half. Kind of doing what we did over here with the evil brick. We cut it down to make a smaller core, and kept all it kept the exact same power. It uses 22 cylinders to make 3,200 horsepower, exactly the same as this motor does, but it cut it and put it into a smaller area so we could waste more space with more cranks and more turbochargers, and it allowed the carbs to be evenly spaced, where here the carbs are oddly spaced. So by making this a conjoined twin motor, by cutting it in half and keeping the same power figures of the core in this, roughly the same, and actually more space. We lost a little bit of density because if we do the core, we're more dense, but then when we add the crank in, the extra 3x2 by 14 layout, we were actually less dense, but we kept all the power stats. And then multiplying it down here, again, we end up with a less dense core, but we got more rooms and evenly spaced carburetors. And the motor, I drove myself crazy trying to figure out this layout. And if I had to compare the two motors, this motor is simplicity mixed with genius, and this motor is more artistry mixed with genius. And I had a terrible time. My brain was hurting trying to figure this motor out. I laid it out. The core was easy for me to figure out. Just looking at the picture, I was able to figure out the core and the turbo layout. So I laid it all out. I put all the turbos laid out, and what I do is I just lay out the turbos regardless what direction they face, and then I come back and I collect all the exhaust I can, and then I try to figure out the layout. And a lot of the exhausts were blocked off, and I couldn't get it seriesed properly, and I couldn't collect all the exhaust properly, and so after trying to collect all the exhaust properly and seeing that I couldn't run the exhaust series, and then trying to run the exhaust series without collecting any exhaust, by the time I figured out the series layout, I was blocking a ton of exhaust. And so what I had to do was I had to prove that my layout was exactly the same as what Killshot's reported stats were. So what I did is I just said, binding box be damned, and I seriesed all my turbos, and then I started making jumpers and connection pipes with a series of my exhaust and making jumpers. And if you do that, you can have a really efficient, this motor gets insanely efficient in the mid-range if you collect every exhaust that's being collected. But to cut the body box, I wasted 4 exhausts here and here. But if you collect those in, the binding box gets even bigger and the motor gets even more efficient. And then, like collecting these 2 exhausts and having to go from this turbo coming outside the body box, going, jumping over them to go to here, the motor gets way more efficient. But I didn't feel it was the efficiency was worth it for how much binding box you're giving up. So I had to go back to Killshot's original design, and I couldn't figure out what he was doing at first. And just looking at pictures, I couldn't see the patterning or anything like that. But what I could see clearly in his picture was this. This one exhaust right here going into the serial chain, and I said, oh, he's series paralleling everything. And we'll have to go into build mode to show it. Let me get to something smaller so it won't be blocking my pattern. And I kind of said, okay, well, what is he doing? And what he's putting serial exhaust into the parallel side. I mean the parallel exhaust into the serial side and running a full series parallel collection system. So I said, what is the implications for that? And so what I started doing is trying to pack the motor down as small as possible and get rid of some of my I guess you'd call them crossover pipes, where exhaust would come over and come around a turbo to still be series and keep the series side and the parallel side separated. And I started looking at it and I started saying, okay, well, I started packing it as small as possible, and there were still places where I was breaking the binding box, and so I had to kind of give in and look at Killshot's original design from the picture, and the best I could tell was he's doing a lot of series and parallel breaking. And you can see here you have a solid single core, and you can see down here you have a solid single core, but you can see here we have one unified exhaust system. And I had to investigate further what is the best system to go with, and right here is where our parallel collection side goes into our serials exhaust. So we come into here, this turbo, and then that turbo goes into this turbo, and right here, here's an exhaust that we want to get into the chain as early as possible. So I spent hours messing around with this. So this turbo, so originally I had this exhaust and this exhaust both going into this part of the chain, because we want to get as many exhausts into the chain as early as possible. If we're going to break series and parallel rule, which I'm excessively compulsive about, if I'm going to forego that, I want to get as many exhausts in the chain as early as possible. So this exhaust went into here and here to get it into, it wouldn't help this turbo back here, but it got it into this turbo sooner. And then we go down here and we come out here, and this exhaust you'd want to collect and get into this chain as soon as possible, and this exhaust you'd want to get as soon as possible. So it comes up here and it chains into this turbo, chains into this turbo, chains into this turbo, goes into here, comes here, 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 and then here you want to get these two exhausts in as early as possible, but it has to go up to this turbo. So we're collecting these exhausts and series in this turbo. So then it comes back here, comes back here, comes back here, and then when I got here I couldn't go anywhere, so I had to break this exhaust and make it go into this separately and lose this exhaust, which loses a little bit of efficiency because it doesn't feed this exhaust to all of these turbos in the series as possible. But I had to do that to get from this turbo down to this turbo, and then down to here, and then down to here, and then down to here, and then these turbos we collect this exhaust and serially collect, and then it goes here, 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 and then again we collect exhaust and connect our turbos, and here we collect the exhaust and connect our turbos serially. Here we collect 2 more exhausts while collecting our turbos serially, and then it goes here, 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 and then it crosses over here, and we basically repeat the same pattern over to where we come to our final turbo and come out. And by manipulating each exhaust, in some cases you don't have a choice. You have to go from this turbo to this turbo, and you're going to collect the two. You can't send this exhaust down through this turbo, which would be an earlier turbo, because you need this spot to connect the turbos serially. So there's no choice in some of these cases. Very few cases. The only real place I really saw it was here. Feeding this exhaust here actually is later in the chain than feeding it down here. And this is the one exhaust I could see in the picture that made me say, oh, I see what he's doing, and made me figure out the best way to optimize that exhaust flow pattern. And once you ran the motor, I played around with it for hours to figure out the best efficiency, and we ended up with these numbers: 1,005 at 10% load. Where since that motor was dubbed the Saturn, Killshot dubbed that motor the Saturn. This little motor back here is the Evil Brick, and the motor is built from is the Hypercube. I don't remember who built this motor, and I don't think they gave it a name. I just dubbed it the Beast. But this motor is only 644 at 1 fuel a second, so Killshot's motor kind of beats it in efficiency. And then at mid-range, this thing goes all the way up to 6,000 at 0.6, whereas this one is 2.1, so it more than cut it in half. And then this motor is 5 fuel a second at the top end, and this motor is 1.2, which I think is like 4.2 times less fuel. So this motor is really, really, really good. And if left to my own devices, me being obsessive compulsive, I would have never built this motor, because it was driving me crazy building this motor, trying to get everything 100% series and parallel separated. But once I threw that out the window and just went with it, I realized that this motor running at 100%, let's see, reaches maximum efficiency and has well over 50 exhaust gases averaged on each turbo. So the series parallel really doesn't hurt this motor, because it's got more than 30 exhaust gases to begin with. So it's only going to really make the mid-range better and the bottom end better. So once I threw that out the window, it kind of opens up more designs. Now, if I was going to throw any kind of shade at this motor, the only thing I see about it is I don't know, and people on the forum kind of brought up the same point, but I still think it's kind of irrelevant. If you had the space to use in this motor, I would say use this motor. And if you was using it as a kinetic drive, I would say if you had the space and you was using it as a kinetic drive where you was spending more time throughout the power range, I would say use this motor, because both of them are both efficient, and both of them you're gonna be having a low amount of fuel tanks. I would say you could put 4 beam fuel tanks with both of these motors at each end of your craft for redundancy in case one tank gets out, and you're still going to have a huge hourly operational range. So each motor has benefits and drawbacks. I would still use Killshot's motor if you had the space, because it's way more efficient. The downside to this motor, I would say, is the wasted cranks. The Beast motor, where I use on my SS Kermit, where I use the Beast motor, I only have one layer armor. I don't have multi-layer armoring because my SS Kermit is a brawler that I built for looks the way I wanted it to look, and then the armor was just whatever I got. And so it uses shields mostly to protect against physical kinetic damage, but missiles and lasers and stuff can get through it and take out my shields. And with only one layer of armor, a sabot round could come through my armor and knock out any one of these exhaust pipes. Now, this is true on every motor on this platform. If you got 100% parallel collection with serial exhaust, if you break any of the parallel connection points, you lose all efficiency. And we could demonstrate that here in the Beast. If I run it, it only uses 5 fuel if we have our parallel side intact. But if we lose our parallel side, the other motor's running. Hold on. We went from 5 fuel a second all the way to 47 fuel a second. And I think it goes all the way up to almost like 50, almost pretty close to 60 if it was 100% load, because we only had a 70% load because something else is running. So any break in the parallel collection side, you lose efficiency. And if you lose on the series side, it depends on where the break is, because if we lost this turbo right here on this side, we wouldn't lose much efficiency because we'd only lose one turbo provide max efficiency to this one carb. So we'd lose efficiency, but we wouldn't lose all that much. But if we lost this turbo, which is where our series parallel connection joins, we would lose all efficiency, just like if we lost our parallel collection side. If we lost it somewhere halfway down the middle, we'd lose half of our efficiency. The only thing I can throw shade at on the Saturn motor here is it uses more space, which that's the design triangle. That has nothing to do with Killshot's design. There's nothing he could really do to make it more efficiency. He has to give up more space, or he has to lose power. So that's not his design flaw. It is more efficient. Well, that's the side effect of wasting more space. You're going to lose density, the design triangle says, because we make it more same power in more space. A positive of his motor is his parallel collection side is more protected. It's more in the center of the motor where the crank is, so that's a positive. His wrap of the motor, the wrap of the core, is more of the series parallel collection sides. There's really nowhere here where you could actually get a good kill shot on the parallel side. Like right here, this exhaust was best served going into the parallel side. Then it would go into the serial side down here, because going into the parallel side, it goes to every carb. That exhaust goes to every turbo, making the mid-range more efficient. Whereas if I went here, it would only be seen by some of them. So getting a shot right here would blow out your parallel side, but most of these other places would only take out the parallel side. I mean the series side. Well, it's a series parallel side. So depending on where the shot is, depends on how much efficiency you lose. And since this is already a more efficient motor, that is a benefit, a positive. So it has better protected parallel side, and damage to the outside wrap with the outside efficiency wrap of the turbos is more I guess variable and random. So that could be both a positive and a negative of this motor. It just depends on how it gets hit, and I'll probably do some further testing on this where I spawn in my Kermit, my SS Kermit, and pull the beast motors out and put two of Killshot's motors in, and then throw, like, 10 Atlases and 10 Atlases with I don't know, something like a Bulwark or something, to where it basically overruns my SS Kermit to where it actually takes damage, to see if these motors are actually more survivable. It's going to be variable because my SS Kermit takes a lot of damage sideways, and this motor would do really good at side impacts on the damage. But one thing the Beast has that Killshot's motor won't have is, yeah, it takes shots on the side, and this one's more exposed in the parallel side than it is in the series side. But the crank is more protected. I very rarely on the Beast motor lose the crank, because say a sabot round comes through, my shields go down, my it just gets destroyed, and a sabot round comes through my arbor and destroys the parallel side. I just lose efficiency. I don't lose power. I lose efficiency, but I don't lose power. And on Killshot's motor, that's less likely to happen. The loss in efficiency is going to be more random. The one downside to this motor I see is the double cranks on the outsides. The bottom crank should be pretty protected because in my Kermit, my deck height is I think 2 blocks higher than my motor room's height. So that only leaves turbos open to being hit and this top side. Now my upper deck above the engine room would kind of protect this crank, but an Erie absolutely wrecks my SS Kermit, because my upper deck right now, I just have my AI temporarily placed in my upper deck, and it's the worst place for right now, but until I finalize the design, it is what it is. But an Erie comes in where my upper deck, I think, stops on my second motor somewhere about right here, my upper floor, and I have a second floor deck open, so these cranks would be like exposed. And so if an Erie got in on top of me and hit me with those big heavy cram cannons through my deck, it would break this crank. And when you break a crank, say I lost this crank right here, you would lose power because we'd lose all the cylinders behind the brake, and we'd lose efficiency because we would lose all the exhaust of all the cylinders connected behind the crank. So if I had to say one bad thing about this motor, is the exposed cranks. Now I will be trying to take this motor and flip it on its end, flip the core on its end and put the cranks on the inside. if I could do that, it'll put the cranks in the protected spot, and the it'll have to be more parallel exhaust collect. I mean, the parallel side will be more wrapped around the motor, and I think what's going to happen to collect that exhaust, I'm going to have to go one more binding box bigger, because the parallel side is going to be on the top here and then on the bottom down here, and it's going to kind of be trapped. So I might have to come around the cylinder and connect them here, but I might also try, since we have over 30 exhaust, I might try to optimize the parallel exhaust a little bit, and if I could do it, I can get, if it's possible, I might be able to get more exhaust into more turbos, and if I could get 60 exhaust into each turbos, then I could cut it in half and have just the top motor independent of the bottom motor, and I might be able to achieve these efficiency numbers or slightly less in maybe a tiny bit more space, and make the motor more survivable, because I see this as an Achilles heel of this motor. Comparing the two directly, I would say use this one if you're using more, more kinetic drive and you had the space. But as they stand right now, this one has that Achilles heels of the exposed cranks. The beast with the crank being embedded deep in the middle and using less space, first of all, there's less space that's going to be hit, because in my engine room SS curve where I've used it is 2 spaces is deck level, so if a shell hits my deck and bounces off, it's usually going to go above the crank on this motor, and I almost never get the crank severed in half on the beast motor, whereas on this motor the bottom half is protected but the top half is not, and it doesn't have a center line, so laying it on its side would better protect it, but let's see, it would actually put it right at the base of my deck. You'd have a crank right at the base of my deck being exposed. So like I said, I'm going to try to flip this motor in on itself and see if I could do that, where you'd have 2 cranks right next to each other, wasting a lot of space. But I hope it shows a few tricks where cutting motors down, you could either keep the power numbers, or you could keep the efficiency numbers of a motor and make it smaller. Running every exhaust, whether it's series or parallel, you should always strive for collecting all your exhausts parallel and then running them through your turbo series. But if you have an exhaust that is available that you're not using, you always want to use, because it always helps efficiency in some way, shape, or form. And then if you have a lot of exhaust that could be put into your series parallel system, if you're going to do that a lot of times, if you have more than 30 exhaust, it really doesn't make much difference to the top end efficiency of the motor. And you should just try to put each exhaust into the chain as soon as possible. And a little more controversial and less clear cut, oh, this motor's running, that's one that's running, is this motor right here, where you put turbos in place of superchargers if elbows are available. It's a little more controversial because it depends on whether you're using your motor as a generator versus a kinetic drive. If you're using a kinetic drive, I would say it's always worth it, because superchargers are dumb. They don't do anything for you at full speed. If you're kinetic drive, it's a little bit more. It depends on where you spend the most time. If you spend your time, say about 52% and below, the superchargers are better. And if you spend it 52% or above, the turbos are better. And I hope that shows you guys a few little more tricks that I've learned recently, and you could use on building yourself some better motors. And I'll see you guys in the next one.